Chapter 2. The next morning, Ray traded seats on the school bus to be closer to the front door. When the bus turned onto the street where he had seen the running boy, Roy slipped his backpack over his shoulder and scowled out the window, waiting. 7 rows back, Dana Matheson was tormenting a sixth grader named Lewis. Lewis was from Haida, and Dana was merciless. As the bus came to a stop at the intersection, Roy poked his head out the window and checked up and down the street. Nobody was running. 7 kids boarded the bus, but the strange, shoeless boy was not among them. It was the same story the next day, and the day after that. By Friday, Roy had pretty much given up. He was sitting 10 rows from the door, reading an X-Men comic, as the bus turned the familiar corner and began to slow down. A movement at the corner of his eye made Roy glance up from his comic book, and there he was on the sidewalk, running again. Same basketball jersey, same grimy shorts, same black-soled feet. As the brakes of the school bus wheezed, Roy grabbed his backpack off the floor and stood up. At that instant, 2 big sweaty hands closed around his neck. "Where you going, cowgirl?" "Let me go," Roy rasped, screaming to break free. The grip on his throat tightened. He felt Dana's ashtray breath on his right ear. "How come you don't got your boots on today? Who ever heard of a cowgirl wearing Air Jordans?" "They're Reeboks!" Roy squeaked. The bus had stopped and the students were starting to board. Roy was furious. He had to get to the door fast before the driver closed and the bus began to roll. But Dana wouldn't let go, digging his fingers into Roy's windpipe. Roy was having trouble getting air and struggling only made it worse. "Look at you!" Dana twirled from behind. "Red as a tomato!" Roy knew the rules about fighting on the bus, but he couldn't think of anything else. He clenched his right fist and brought it up blindly over his shoulder, as hard as he could. The punch landed on something moist and rubbery. There was a gargled cry. Then Dana's hands fell away from Roy's neck. Panting, Roy bolted for the door of the bus just as the last student, a tall girl with curly blonde hair and red-framed glasses, came up the steps. Roy clumsily edged past her and jumped to the ground. "Where do you think you're going?" the girl demanded. "Hey, wait!" the bus driver shouted, but Roy was already a blur. The running boy was way ahead of him, but Roy figured he could stay close enough to keep him in sight. He knew the kid couldn't go at full speed forever. He followed him for several blocks, over fences, through shrubbery, weaving through yapping dogs and lawn sprinklers and hot tubs. Eventually, Roy found himself tiring. This kid is amazing, he thought. Maybe he's practicing for the track team. Once Roy thought he saw the boy glance over his shoulder, as if he knew he was being pursued, but Roy couldn't be certain. The boy was still far ahead from him, and Roy was gulping like a beached trout. His shirt was soaked and perspiration poured off his forehead, stinging his eyes. The last house in the subdivision was still under construction, but the shoeless boy dashed heedlessly through the lumber and loose nails. 3 men hanging drywall stopped to holler at him, but the boy never broke stride. One of the same workers made a one-armed lunge at Roy but missed. Suddenly, there was grass under his feet again, the greenest, softest grass that Roy had ever seen. He realized that he was on a golf course, and that the blond kid was tearing down the middle of a long, lush fairway. On one side was a row of tall Australian pines, and the other side was a milky man-made lake. Roy could see 4 brightly dressed figures ahead, gesturing at the barefoot boys he ran by. Roy gritted his teeth and kept going. His legs felt like wet cement, and his lungs were on fire. 100 yards ahead, the boy cut sharply to the right and disappeared in the pine trees. Roy doggedly aimed himself for the woods. An angry shout echoed, and Roy noticed the people in the fairway were waving their arms at him too. He kept right on running. Moments later, there was a distant glint of sunlight on metal, followed by a muted thwack. Roy didn't actually see the golf ball until it came down 6 feet in front of him. He had no time to duck or dive out of the way. All he could do was turn his head and brace for the blow. The bounce caught him squarely above the left ear, and at first, it didn't even hurt. Then Roy felt himself swaying and spinning as a brilliant gout of fireworks erupted inside his skull. He felt himself falling for what seemed like a long time, falling as softly as a drop of rain on velvet. The golfers ran up and saw Roy face down the sand trap. They thought he was dead. Roy heard their frantic cries but didn't move. The sugar-white sand felt cool against his burning cheeks, and he was very sleepy. The cowgirl jab, that was my own fault, he thought. He told the kids at school he was from Montana, cattle country, when in fact, he'd been born in Detroit, Michigan. Roy's mother and father had moved away from Detroit when he was only a baby, so it seemed silly to call him his hometown. In Roy's mind, he didn't really have a hometown. His family had never stayed anywhere long enough for Roy to feel settled. Of all the places the Eberharts had lived, Roy's favorite was Bozeman, Montana. The snaggle-peaked mountains, the braided green rivers, the sky so blue it seemed like a painting. Roy had never imagined anywhere so beautiful. The Eberharts stayed 2 years, 7 months, and 11 days. Roy wanted to stay forever. On the night his father announced he'd be moving to Florida, Roy locked himself in his bedroom and cried. His mother caught him climbing out the window with a snowboard and a plastic tackle box in which he had packed underwear, socks, a fleece ski jacket, and a $100 savings bond his grandfather had given to him as a birthday present. His mother assured Roy that he would love Florida. Everyone in America wants to move there, she said. It's so sunny and gorgeous. Then Roy's father had poked his head in the door and said with somewhat forced enthusiasm, "And don't forget Disney World." "Disney World's an armpit," Roy stated flatly. "Compared to Montana, I want to stay here." As usual, he was outvoted. So, when their homeroom teacher, Trace Middle, asked the new kid where he was from, he stood up and proudly said Bozeman, Montana. The same answer he gave in the school bus when Dana Matheson accosted him his first day, and from then on, Ray was Tex, or Cowgirl, or Roy Rogers Hart. It was his own fault for not saying Detroit.